That was a sort of magical time in my life doing that. I mean, it's like a dream when you're there. It's those incredible beaches, that incredible life.
At first glance, Death in Paradise looks like the easiest detective job in the world. The fictional island of Saint Marie has bright blue water, warm beaches, colorful houses, friendly locals, and endless sunshine. Every week, a murder happens, and a British detective arrives at the scene, studies the strange clues, questions a group of suspicious people, and finally gathers everyone together to explain exactly what happened. It is a simple formula, but it has become one of television's most reliable mysteries. Yet there is something strange about the show that viewers cannot ignore. The detective almost never stays forever. One arrives, becomes part of the island, grows as a person, and eventually leaves. Then another detective steps off the plane and starts the same journey all over again. Richard Poole was followed by Humphrey Goodman, then Jack Mooney, Neville Parker, and later a new generation of detectives. Normally, losing the main character could destroy a television series. The audience becomes attached to the lead, and replacing that person can feel like starting an entirely different show. But Death in Paradise somehow turned this danger into one of its biggest strengths. The secret is that the detective is never really the permanent center of the story. Saint Marie is. The island remains while the people change. Each detective arrives with a different problem. Richard is too rigid and uncomfortable with change. Humphrey is emotionally lost and looking for a new direction. Jack is carrying deep grief after losing his wife. Neville is controlled by fear, anxiety, and discomfort. Each man believes he is simply coming to solve crimes, but Saint Marie gives him something much more difficult to solve, himself. That is why the departures feel so meaningful. The detectives do not simply leave because their actors are finished with the show. Their stories are designed around change. Once the island has taught them what they need to learn, their journey naturally moves somewhere else. Richard Poole was the detective who established the strange relationship between Saint Marie and the people who came to investigate its murders. Played by Ben Miller, Richard was almost the complete opposite of what anyone would expect from a man living in paradise. He wore formal suits in the Caribbean heat, disliked the sand, struggled with the relaxed island lifestyle, and often seemed personally offended by the sunshine. His strict personality and dry sense of humor made him very different from the warm, cheerful people around him. Yet that was exactly what made him work. Richard hated the environment, but he was brilliant at his job. He could walk into a confusing crime scene and notice details that everyone else had missed. Beneath his difficult personality, however, was a lonely man who depended heavily on rules and control. Saint Marie slowly challenged that way of living. He began to trust his team, especially Camille, and slowly became more connected to the community. He never completely transformed into a man who loved beaches and island life, but he began to understand that the world did not always need to operate according to his rules. Then the show made a decision that changed everything. When Ben Miller left the series, Richard was killed at the beginning of the third series. He was murdered with an ice pick, making him the first detective in the series to become a victim himself. For a cozy mystery show, it was a shocking choice. Richard had spent his time explaining murders, and suddenly he was the mystery everyone had to solve. His death broke the show's original formula, but it also proved that Death in Paradise could survive without him. More importantly, it told viewers that no detective was guaranteed to stay forever. Richard became the original memory of Saint Marie, and every detective who followed had to step into a role that he had already made famous. His departure was painful, but it gave the series permission to change. Humphrey Goodman had one of the hardest jobs in the history of Death in Paradise. He arrived immediately after Richard Poole's death, which meant that viewers were naturally going to compare him with the detective they had just lost. If Humphrey had been too similar to Richard, he would have looked like a replacement with nothing new to offer. If he had been too different, some viewers might have felt that the show had lost its identity. Instead, Chris Marshall brought a completely different kind of detective to Saint Marie. Richard had been stiff, serious, and controlled, while Humphrey was clumsy, emotional, friendly, and sometimes wonderfully chaotic. He could look completely lost one moment and then suddenly connect the most important clues in the case. His warmth made him easier to love, but his personal story gave him more depth than a simple comic character. Humphrey arrived while his personal life was falling apart, and St. Marie slowly became the place where he rebuilt himself. Through his work and friendships, he began to understand what he wanted from life. He found happiness on the island, but eventually he discovered something even more important: he wanted to follow his heart. His relationship with Martha became a major part of his journey, and his eventual decision to leave St. Marie showed that not every detective needs a tragic ending. Richard had died because the writers needed a dramatic break. Humphrey left because he had found a life worth pursuing somewhere else. Years later, his story continued through Beyond Paradise, proving that leaving St. Marie did not mean the character had stopped being important. His departure also taught the show another valuable lesson. A detective can leave the island and still remain part of the audience's emotional world. Humphrey's exit showed that the series did not have to destroy a character simply because the actor was leaving. Sometimes the most satisfying ending is allowing someone to move forward. In that way, Humphrey's story became one of the clearest examples of how Death in Paradise uses departures as part of its storytelling rather than treating them as a problem. Jack Mooney brought something different to St. Marie. Played by Ardal O'Hanlon, Jack was not as uncomfortable with island life as Richard, and he did not have the same chaotic energy as Humphrey. He was friendly, talkative, funny, and naturally good at making people feel comfortable. Suspects could speak to Jack without immediately realizing how carefully he was listening. His detective style depended less on showing off and more on conversation. He allowed people to relax, and once they relaxed, they often revealed things they had planned to hide. But behind Jack's friendly personality was a man dealing with grief. He had lost his wife, and that loss followed him to St. Marie. The island gave him a place where he could work, raise his daughter, and slowly rebuild his life. For Jack, paradise was not really about the beaches. It was about having enough space to breathe after a painful period. His time on St. Marie helped him become comfortable with life again, but the island could not become a permanent hiding place. Eventually, Jack realized that healing did not mean forgetting the past or staying in the same place forever. It meant being brave enough to move forward. That made his departure different from both Richard's and Humphrey's. Jack did not leave because he hated the island, and he did not leave because he had failed as a detective. He left because his personal journey had reached a natural point. This is one of the smartest ideas behind the show's changing detectives. Each character arrives because something in his life is unsettled. The island gives him time, friendship, and experiences that help him deal with that problem. But once the problem has been faced, the character needs a new challenge. If Jack had stayed forever, his story might eventually have become repetitive. His departure allowed the audience to remember him as a man who had come to St. Marie carrying grief and left as someone ready to live again. In that sense, St. Marie was never meant to be the final destination for Jack. It was a place that helped him prepare for the next part of his life. Neville Parker took the idea of the uncomfortable detective to an entirely new level. Played by Ralph Little, Neville arrived as a man who seemed almost completely unsuited to St. Marie. He had allergies, strong food preferences, discomfort around insects, difficulty with heat, and a long list of fears and habits that made ordinary island life challenging for him. At first, these problems were a major source of comedy. But over time, they became much more important to the character. Neville was not simply a man who disliked the Caribbean. He was someone whose fears had made his world smaller. He preferred familiar routines and struggled when life moved outside his control. St. Marie forced him to face exactly those things. Every new case pushed him into situations he could not predict. Every new friendship required him to become more open. Every emotional relationship forced him to take risks. Unlike Richard, who slowly learned to loosen his grip on control, Neville had to learn how to live with uncertainty. His journey took several years, which gave viewers more time to watch the change happen. He did not suddenly become fearless. He remained awkward and anxious, but those qualities no longer controlled every decision he made. His relationship with Florence also became an important part of his emotional development. Neville had spent much of his life protecting himself from situations that could hurt him, but love required him to take the exact kind of emotional risk he usually avoided. When Neville finally decided to leave St. Marie, his departure felt like the completion of a much longer journey. He was not escaping paradise because he could not handle it. Instead, he was leaving because he had become brave enough to choose a different future. That is what made Neville's ending especially meaningful. Richard had been changed by the island in a tragic way. Humphrey found love and followed it. Jack learned that grief could not define his entire life. Neville learned that fear did not have to make his choices for him. His departure showed the audience that St. Marie had finally accomplished its biggest task. It had taken one of its most frightened visitors and helped him become someone capable of making a bold decision. By the time a new detective arrives after Neville, the biggest challenge is no longer convincing viewers that the show can survive another change. The audience already knows it can. The real challenge is making the new detective feel necessary. Richard, Humphrey, Jack, and Neville were all different, and each brought a new personality to the same basic format. That means every new detective enters St. Marie carrying the weight of all the previous ones. Viewers naturally compare them. Is this detective as sharp as Richard? As warm as Humphrey? As relaxed as Jack? As vulnerable as Neville? A new actor cannot simply copy what worked before. The character needs a different emotional problem. That is why the changing detective formula remains important to the series. The cases may follow familiar patterns, but the person solving them gives each era its own personality. The supporting cast also helps make these transitions possible. Characters such as Commissioner Selwyn Patterson provide continuity while the lead detective changes. The police station remains familiar. The island locations remain familiar. Catherine's bar remains part of the world. The audience knows the basic rhythm of an episode, so they can spend their attention learning about the new detective rather than learning the entire show from the beginning. This is another reason Death in Paradise has been able to replace its main character repeatedly without losing its identity. The show does not replace everything at once. It changes one major piece while keeping enough familiar elements around it. Behind the scenes, there are also practical reasons why actors eventually leave. Filming a show set in a tropical paradise can look like a dream from the outside, but actors may spend long periods away from their homes and families. The heat, humidity, long production schedules, and travel can make the experience demanding.